A pregnant widow walks into her dead husband's family estate looking for protection and almost immediately realizes the people offering to take care of her may be the biggest threat in the house. That is the setup for Confinement, Paramount's new British psychological horror thriller. And the first trailer makes one thing very clear. This family is far too interested in the baby. Nathalie Emmanuel stars as Stella, a recently widowed woman who is still trying to recover from the loss of her husband while preparing to give birth. With nowhere else to turn, she accepts an invitation from his estranged family and moves into their secluded estate. At first, the offer sounds generous. They tell her she is safe. They tell her she belongs there. They insist that they take care of their own, and the more they say it, the less believable it becomes. The trailer quickly shifts from grief drama into something much more uncomfortable. Stella begins noticing how closely the family watches her, how often they discuss the baby, and how little control she actually has over her own life. The house is beautiful, but it does not feel welcoming. It feels controlled. That distinction is important because Confinement appears to be using one of the oldest horror ideas in a very direct way. The place that is supposed to protect you becomes the place you cannot escape. The official premise says Stella is eventually forced to remain at the estate until she gives birth. That changes everything. This is no longer an awkward family visit. It is imprisonment, and from that point, the movie seems interested in keeping Stella and the audience unsure about exactly what is happening. Gee, is the family involved in something supernatural? Is the child connected to some kind of curse? Or is Stella's grief and isolation causing her to question her own perception? Those questions immediately bring several familiar movies to mind. There is obviously a little Rosemary's Baby in the idea of a pregnant woman surrounded by people who seem to know more about her child than she does. The wealthy, secretive family creates a ready or not atmosphere, while Stella's position as an outsider trapped inside a disturbing social structure makes the Get Out comparison almost unavoidable. That is both the appeal and the biggest risk. Confinement is playing with material audiences already understand. We have seen strange families, isolated estates, pregnancy horror, hidden rituals, and characters being told they are imagining things. So the movie will need more than atmosphere to stand out. The trailer's strongest element is Nathalie Emmanuel. She has to carry almost the entire emotional structure because the story only works if we believe Stella is vulnerable without making her passive. She is grieving, pregnant, isolated, and surrounded by people who constantly present control as kindness. That creates a very specific kind of fear. A masked killer is easy to identify. A family member smiling while taking away your freedom is much harder to fight. The trailer leans heavily into that discomfort. Conversations begin politely and end with threats hiding underneath them. Doors seem to become boundaries. Every gesture of help comes with another restriction. And then there is the baby. The family's obsession with Stella's unborn child appears to be the central mystery. They do not simply want her to remain safe until delivery. They appear to believe the child belongs to something larger than Stella herself. Whether that means inheritance, bloodline, ritual, or something supernatural is still being kept hidden. That uncertainty is probably the smartest marketing decision the trailer makes. If the movie reveals too early that the family is part of a cult, the mystery disappears. If it confirms the child is cursed, then the psychological tension becomes less interesting. Instead, Confinement seems to want us trapped inside Stella's perspective. She does not know who to trust, and neither do we. Claire Forlani appears to be one of the most important members of the family, and the trailer gives her exactly the kind of calm authority that works well in stories like this. She does not need to scream or behave like an obvious villain. The dangerous characters in this kind of movie are usually the ones who believe everything they are doing is completely reasonable. Ben Cura, Eloise Lovell Anderson, and Charlie Hiscock round out the central cast. But the trailer is intentionally vague about who might become Stella's ally and who is participating in whatever the family is planning. Director Peter Howitt is not primarily associated with horror, and that could actually help. A filmmaker coming from outside the genre may focus more on character, social tension, and suspense instead of familiar jump scares. The screenplay comes from Will Honley and April Maguire, and the contained setup is strong. One remote estate, one pregnant protagonist, and a family that refuses to let her leave. You do not need a huge budget for that. You need pressure. The title itself is doing a lot of work. Confinement refers to Stella physically being trapped inside the estate, but it also connects to pregnancy, grief, and the feeling that everyone around her has decided what her future should look like. That is where the movie could rise above its familiar setup, not by asking only whether the family is dangerous, but how easily concern becomes control. Every member of this household can justify what they are doing by claiming they are protecting Stella or protecting the child. The horror begins when her own wishes stop mattering. The trailer does show moments that suggest something genuinely supernatural may be happening. Stella begins questioning whether the baby itself is connected to something dark, and the family's behavior becomes increasingly ritualistic. But I hope the movie does not answer that question too quickly. The strongest psychological horror keeps both explanations alive for as long as possible. Maybe Stella is being manipulated. Maybe she is losing control. Maybe both are true. That ambiguity is what can make a relatively small movie feel much bigger. Confinement is heading directly to VOD, and this kind of intimate thriller may fit that format perfectly. Sometimes all you need is one unsettling house, one vulnerable character, and a group of people insisting that everything is fine. The concern, of course, is that the movie may feel too familiar. If the story plays exactly the way we expect, Confinement could become another competent but forgettable streaming thriller. But if the family's obsession with the baby leads somewhere genuinely strange, this could surprise people. Nathalie Emmanuel has the screen presence to make Stella's fear believable, and the simple setup gives her plenty of room to carry the movie. At this point, the question is whether the screenplay has one more idea hidden behind the obvious comparisons. Confinement arrives on VOD September 1st, 2026. I want to know what you think after this first trailer. Does this look like an effective mix of Rosemary's Baby, Get Out, and Ready or Not? Or does the story already feel too familiar? Because the trailer may not be reinventing psychological horror, but one thing is certain: when someone smiles and says, "Trust me, we take care of our own," that is probably the exact moment Stella should start looking for the nearest exit.